Hi, everybody. Welcome back. It's Word Balloon, the comic book conversation show. John Suttress here. We look back at a fantastic conversation I had with the late, great Denny O'Neil. We lost Denny back in 2020, and this conversation happened in 2018. It was Denny's birthday this weekend. He would have been 85 years old, and I remain a fan. He was really one of the first writers going back to the early 70s that I really took notice of and could tell the difference between a Denny O'Neil script and some of the old guard that was still part of the Bronze Age of DC. You're going to hear a lot of Bronze Age and Silver Age stories from Denny as the writer of great things like Hard Traveling Heroes and the great Batman Ra's al Ghul story, although I'd like to point out that Denny pronounces it Ra's al Ghul. And really up until Batman Begins, I always pronounced it as Ra's al Ghul, and in fact, I know the Batman animated series also called him Ra's al Ghul, but whatever. They adapted that great story by Denny and Neil Adams, and it really is a standout for the animated series. I'm sure you agree. This is a two-parter because it was a nice lengthy conversation. Denny was recuperating from a really bad auto accident. He had a really tough couple last decades in his life. He had a heart condition and got just tossed around the back seat of a car with a car accident. And but thank God, Larry O'Neill reached out to me and said, "Dad's just kind of sitting looking at the walls and bored. You did a great conversation with him a few years back. Would you be interested in talking to him again?" Of course I would. I had 3 amazing conversations with Denny before his passing, and it means a lot to me that I got to connect with one of my favorite writers and Batman editors, and I'm sure you feel the same way. The great Denny O'Neil, looking back at the DC Universe through his eyes. Parts 1 and 2 on today's Word Balloon. Word Balloon is brought to you by AlexRossArt.com. Alex is a good friend of the show, and I am honored that he aligns himself with Word Balloon, and good Lord, we all love his iconic art, whether it's for DC, Marvel, things like Monty Python, the Monkees, David Bowie, so many other great licensed things, the Beatles. If you go to AlexRossArt.com, you will find great value for your dollar, whether you can spring for something like original cover art or pages to lithos and posters, every price point you can imagine, you will find something and a beautiful image from AlexRossArt.com. Word Balloon is also presented by my listeners, the League of Word Balloon listeners. The help that I get via contributions from Patreon, patreon.com/wordballoon. You hear the entertainment that I provide from Word Balloon every day, that I do a new episode. I am very fortunate to have the great creators of comics and pop culture willing to come on and give you great entertainment. I hope you will consider making an actual cash contribution via Patreon, even $1 a month. But really, if Word Balloon is worth the price of a comic book a month to you, it would be greatly appreciated if you slide that extra money you would put on an issue of a comic book to Word Balloon via Patreon. Patreon.com/wordballoon. Thank you, League of Word Balloon listeners. If you're ready, we'll dive in.
Splash.
Welcome back, Denny O'Neil, to Word Balloon. As I was just telling you off the air, it's a pleasure to have you back, and I appreciate your clarity of memory and your stories. How are things going in terms of, last time we spoke, you had released your semi-autobiography, half fiction, half true tales, and how's the response been?
That book is the best kept secret since the invasion of Normandy.
Oh, man. I'm assuming you're going to have the autobiography with you for Terrificon for people to buy and sign, I hope.
I guess I am. They only gave me 10 comps, and I pretty much gave all those away, so I bought 15 more copies. I do have some copies.
Great.
I don't know what to do about that book. I don't know even what I think about it. If you want to save yourself 5 years worth of psychotherapy, write an autobiographical novel, because the feedback I have gotten, people remember things I didn't even know about because I did them in blackouts. And a lot of them are pretty bad, pretty ugly. But I had no memory of them until I get reminded, and then I realized, God, I was a prick. I could have been a monster.
Yeah, and then facing those kind of, past behavior and stuff, yeah, that's got to be humbling. Or is it because, again, these are memories that were blank, that they are kind of surprising, and I don't know, how do you process that?
You face them, and my ex-girlfriend has filled in a lot of blanks. My brother, Dave, and my brother, Tom, have filled in a lot of the blanks. It was worse than I thought.
Wow.
I don't quite know how I got through that without really damaging myself. But I did, and I don't know why some people are able to turn that corner and other people aren't. I didn't plan for the novel I wrote to be as much about drinking as it was, but if you're trying to write about that time in the history of comics, and you're trying to do it from one viewpoint, it's very hard. I mean, without completely making the whole thing up out of whole cloth, it's very hard to not acknowledge those things. So, 40% of the way through the book, I said, well, this is a battle that's not worth fighting. I will simply tell the story, and we'll see where it goes.
I wonder if when you were writing things like that famous Green Lantern, Green Arrow story about Speedy's addiction,
Mm-hmm.
how much of it, were you in a place that you could, write about that kind of addiction? And were you in denial of your own issues, or, where was it in the context of your drinking? Did it inform that story at all?
It probably did. There is a couple of panels very early on in the continuity in which they mention that alcoholism is another form of addiction. I was at a point where I was getting drunk 5 or 6 nights a week. I now know that I was violent and ugly a lot of that time.
Wow.
But nobody was calling me an alcoholic yet. My mother went to her grave without putting my name and the word alcohol in the same sentence.
And what years were these? What decades were these that this was happening?
This is mostly the 70s.
Wow.
I mean, the novel started out as something very different than what it ended up as. And what I wanted to do was tell the story of how comics came of age.
Yeah.
My son was twisting one arm, and I guess Mary Fran was twisting the other, and they kept saying, "You should like your story." And I objected to that, but I finally agreed if I could combine it with a fantasy and not have any of my self-imposed rules, it would be an interesting thing to try. It's writing a novel the way we were taught in college novels are written, and they're mostly not written that way. But, sit down, wait for the angel of inspiration to light on your shoulder and whisper in your ear, and then make it up as you go along. I've written about 10 novels. Only 2 did I make up as I was going along. And one, if I had my way, every single copy of that book in the world would vanish, would suddenly evaporate, because I certainly don't want anybody to read it who hasn't already, and it does have my name on the cover. That was Well, it was a pretty easy job to do, and I did have the experience of writing a novel, writing a science fiction novel. When that was completed and published, I realized I am now a science fiction writer. I have published a book that has been marketed as science fiction, and I don't know what an atom is. So I tried to fill in that huge gap in my education. I mean, I went to St. Louis U, and if you were an English major, you didn't take any science courses. You weren't allowed to.
Okay.
But it occurred to me, and I was right, that anybody who lives in our time, in our era, should know some science, especially if you're going to presume to write about it. So there was a book called 1, 2, 3, Infinity that was a popularization of Einstein's theories. And that book was a huge help and a good start. And then now I've got probably 100 college courses on disc across the room there, and maybe 20-25% of them have to do with science and math. I still can't do math, but I find science fascinating. There's an item in the Gannett papers this morning about how our galaxy ate another galaxy.
Wow.
You know, yeah, I mean, I find that stuff really cool.
Sure. Prior to that exploration of science, do you feel that your writing was more space opera then in terms of science fiction?
Well, no, I didn't think about it very much. One of the secrets of being a professional writer of the kind that I am is don't burden yourself with being an author, or don't carry into the job a lot of expectations. If I can get an editor and say, we need this by the 25th, it has to be 75,000 words, and that gives me some problems to solve. Okay, I know I can solve problems. I don't operate the way my son does. He is very scrupulous about getting every syllable right. I'm not. I think it's a job, and if I start thinking about, well, I'm competing with Alfred Bester here, I'm competing with Isaac Asimov, I'll be paralyzed. I'm not as good as those people. I never will be, or never was. So if I think about it the way I used to think about newspaper work, the press thing, he's going to press the red button at 10 o'clock. My story has to be on there, on the press.
Yep.
That I can handle. When I have a book to write, I do simple long division. I can do that much math. Beyond that, I'm lost. But if I have 100 days to do this, and it has to be 100,000 words, that's how long I've got. That's how much I have to do every day. In the first hardcover, I was in a bad car crash in the middle of writing it. This was Batman Retires, the first really major continuity we did. Nightfall, it was called. And I had to kind of alter my method for 3 weeks. I couldn't write or do any work, but we made it.
Wow.
Charlie Kostman and I spent the last weekend sitting in my bedroom in Brooklyn, going over the manuscript and editing it there and then. It had to be on the presses by noon Monday. This was Friday. Charlie and I spent the weekend editing that book, and we made the deadline. Charlie gets huge thanks. He was one of the best editors I've ever had. And the book, given all the handicaps that there were in getting the thing done, one of which was we knew we were going to do this novelization, and I didn't know that there was going to be any BBC adaptation, but I knew that there would be comic books and other stuff. And the deadline would be non-negotiable. So, but I said, I'm writing 2 or 3 comic books a month. I'm editing a franchise that are only 24 hours in the day. I can't manage this. There just isn't enough time. And Mary Fran said, if you let somebody else do this, you'll never forgive yourself. And I said, well, when you put it like that, you're absolutely right. So every Saturday morning, Mary Fran and I would get in the car and go out to the end of Brooklyn to a shopping mall, meet Charlie Kochman. I would give him the work I had done in the past 6 days. He edited as he went along, and then, as I said, we did the final rewrites and edits really under the gun. Mary Fran bringing in cookies and coffee every 5 or 6 hours. And we got through it. I am delighted that I had that experience. And I never want to do anything like that again. I bought a computer. I bought a laptop computer. I hadn't used any computers up to that point. But driving to St. Louis, we both got sleepy, Mary Fran and I, after lunch. I had been driving, and I told her, you've got to do this. I can't keep my eyes open. She said, I can't either. I'll tell you what, you drive for the first hour, and then I'll take it. We hit a wall doing 70 in the middle of that hour. So we spent Christmas Day in an intensive care ward in a little mountain town in Pennsylvania.
Jesus.
And understand, I had the book about 40% done. The car, I'm told by people who saw the accident, flipped over 3 times, and the computer was loose in the back seat. So we got put into an intensive care ward. And the doctor asked what he could do for me, and I said, go out to wherever what's left of the car is and get my computer.
Wow.
The computer was fine, no glitches. I should have written Apple a thank you letter because did that as a hardcover, and we knew it was going to be a big deal. In fact,
Sure.
we sort of set out to do a big deal Batman project. What I didn't know was that over across the corridor, Mike Carlin was doing something very similar with Superman. Same thing. He dies,
Yes.
comes back.
Yeah.
So I eventually went to Paul and said, why didn't you tell me that Mike was doing this? Because we have 2 stories going at the same time. We're getting 1 year's benefit out of this. We could have gotten 2 years. And he said, no, I did that deliberately because we want to tell the fans, hey, look at these scenes. Stuff is really happening over there, all over the place.
Yeah.
I don't know if he was right or wrong, but he did have, as always with Paul, he has reasons. And they're generally good ones.
It piqued my interest. I mean, I was certainly reading both stories. And that's interesting because I thought that Nightfall almost was inspired by the Superman Doomsday and Death of Superman story. So that's interesting in that typical way that sometimes it's just it's in the atmosphere. And you guys independently were both thinking along the same lines. That's pretty interesting. And I don't think a lot of people knew that. Pretty amazing.
No, I'm sure that a lot of people thought as you did, but I was following in Mike's footsteps. And if you know how publishing worked, it wasn't possible for me to follow in his footsteps because we had the same lead time. We had the same deadline.
Sure. Wow. Nightfall really was, I think, a terrific story. And was it in response to the things that were happening at Image and those more extreme superheroes that, those guys that left Marvel were doing on their own?
No, I knew about those guys. Image sent their whole company up to drop in on DC and make a visit. And at least I think some of my colleagues thought, well, they're, coming to make peace with us. And that they were telling us they were going into competition with us, which they did very successfully for a few years. Mm-hmm. But what happened with us is, I guess my primary concern was always storytelling, and I realized that I had the freedom to do a 2,000-word story with a character who it has been estimated would be recognized by 80% of the people on the planet. And I thought, this is a rare gift they are giving me as a storyteller. I can actually do this. I don't know if we can bring it off, but I know that nobody will stop me from trying. So we had done the Robin Dies story, and I thought that sends a message to the readers, the loyal readers, that we are not above killing Batman. So we were at a retreat very close to where I'm sitting. I didn't know about Nyack, but it's across the river from Tarrytown. And we realized if we're going to make the world think that Batman is dead, it's a pretty big step to take. I better get permission. So either one of my assistants or I called New York every 90 minutes or so and explained what we were going to do and said, it's not too late. We've plotted the next 6 months, but it's not too late to change. If there's going to be any problem with this, tell me. And I got all the go-aheads I needed, so cut to 3 months later, and we're into the story, and I'm crossing a lobby from the building, at the building where DC had its headquarters, and I run into an executive who tells me I have to bring Batman back to life. And I tried to explain, look, if nobody reads any Batman this year and they pick it up in a year, they won't know that anything has happened. We're going to put all the pieces back where you would like them to be. Didn't make any difference, so I had to compromise our story by inventing that subplot where Batman disguises himself as a British detective. As a writer, it gave me a challenge. Can I do British, a convincing British accent?
Okay.
In cold print. That compromised the story pretty badly. And my guess, based only on experience with that world, is that the people we were calling during the retreat did not bother to ask their superiors if it was okay to do this. So for the guys in the real big offices, this was a bad shock to them. Batman's dead. Batman is worth billions.
Well, yeah, this is in the midst of the movies, obviously, and I'm sure things were. I mean, sales certainly hadn't dropped as I understood it, or maybe they did. I don't know. So, what was your? Do you mind revealing what your original story plan was? Were you planning to, after killing Batman, revive him, or did you want him to stay dead and have John Paul Valley or Dick Grayson, someone else, taking over the mantle?
Well, we live in the real world, and I knew I would not get away with permanently killing Batman. But I thought I could get away with having him off stage for a year. Mm-hmm. So that was really what we were going to do. Batman goes off. I hadn't plotted it that far. One of the basic disagreements I had with my crew was they wanted to plot every beat at the retreats, and I wanted to know what the big events for the next 6 months are, and let's give our writers some elbow room to come up with better ideas. So we were going to bring Bruce Wayne back, probably more or less as he was brought back eventually, though one of my freelance writers had some uncharitable things to say about curing somebody by laying on of the hands. It's since been done on television series. But I was going to replace Batman with Jean-Paul Valley for a year, and then maybe kill off Azrael, and everything would be as it was. Almost when we were almost at the end, they asked me to do Azrael as a hero and as a monthly book. Well, again, it was, if I let somebody else do this, I'll never forgive myself. But he was conceived as a villain.
Right.
So I don't know, I have very mixed feelings about the series. I think maybe the middle run, the middle third, was pretty weak, and the rest of it was probably okay. I never read published material, and that's not an exception. They did do another Azrael series and neglected to pay me for that, and I decided not to make a fuss about that.
Wow.
But
yeah, that's
they are now obligated to pay us for ancillary use of stuff we've created, which is a huge step forward from, say, 10 years ago.
That's great to hear, and I know you mentioned that last time, like they're using Leslie Tompkins in Gotham, and I'm glad that you're being compensated for that. I just talked to Jerry Ordway, and he was telling me about how Supergirl was using Cat Grant, and that he was being compensated. So no, that's great to hear. And God, I mean, geez, man, the additions to the Batman house, if you put it in architecture terms, that you made over these decades and stuff, absolutely, man. I hope you're getting paid, and I'm glad to hear that it has gotten better. And I understand that, as you told me in our last conversation, that Howard Chaykin's lawyer has been pretty instrumental in kind of making all that stuff happen. Am I correct?
Yeah, he's a very good man, and a very nice man, and a very good lawyer. He
good.
When the need for a lawyer arose in my life, I had the indispensable Larry call around. I said, see if you can find me who the best lawyer for comic books is. And he came up with Harris Miller, who was amazingly cooperative and very generous. He could have charged me 2 or 3 times what he did. So, yeah, Harris, I've had occasion to call him once or twice since. Well, in the novel, the hero of the novel was originally Captain Power.
Yes.
And I had Harris look up Captain Power, and he said, well, there are 3 Captain Powers who are actually under copyright. Probably nobody will make a fuss, but they could if they wanted to. So that's why we changed it. But Harris he just did that as a favor to me.
That's
yeah,
cool.
I can find that out.
That's excellent. Yeah, man. Very cool.
The really good news happened when we went to see Batman versus Superman. And we looked at that. When I heard that they were making that, I thought, are they aware of what they've let themselves in for? These characters have never belonged in the same universe. It's an accident of publishing history that they are yoked. But it's not a good idea, because one guy juggle sons and one guy can bench press probably 500 pounds and swim real fast and stuff. But they're not the same kind of character. The mythology is real different. But we saw at the beginning credits of that movie, Batman co-created by Bob Kane and Bill Finger. So when we got home, I know Bill Finger's granddaughter a little bit. I've been on panels with her, and I had her phone number. So Mary Fran called her when we got home and said, how did you... Denny never was able to put your grandfather's name on anything that had to do with Batman. Was this a one-time only thing? And Althea said, no, we actually finally won a lawsuit. And from now on, the name Bill Finger will be, anytime you see the name Batman, you'll see Bill Finger. Bob Kane's name is still on it, and he had virtually nothing to do with the character as we know it. Mm-hmm. But at least Althea, Bill died, I'm told, broke and probably drinking too much. But my one evening with him was very drunk.
Wow.
But Althea, at least his granddaughter, will live comfortably. When I went out to visit the set, one of the Time Warner executives told me that every time we do a Batman movie, I write a 7-figure check for Bob Kane.
Wow.
So, like in the mid-50s, being paid for Batman probably didn't amount to much, but those movies have made billions with a B, of course. And little surprise, little bonus, they're good movies.
Yeah, absolutely. Most of them. Certainly most of them.
Well, the last 30, I don't count Joel Schumacher's contribution.
Understood. I think a lot of fans agree with you on that.
Well, apparently Joel agrees.
Yeah, I heard him on Fresh Air, the NPR interview show. And he talked about having to create scenes. They would bring him a toy prototype and say, we need a scene like this in Batman and Robin. And I think that kind of obviously contributed to the goofiness of the Clooney movie, certainly. The Kilmer movie also a little, not as great as, the two that Tim Burton did. But I thought Val Kilmer did okay. In spite of a lot of the zaniness, and you've got Jim Carrey as the Riddler. And, man, what a waste of Tommy Lee Jones. Wouldn't it have been interesting, I'm sure you agree, to see him really get into the, two faces, literally, of Harvey Dent. And they
apparently he was directed to play Two-Face like the Joker.
Wow.
He played him campy.
Yeah. And they really barely got into that wonderful backstory of Harvey Dent, the district attorney that worked with Batman. And I even very quickly, there was like a moment of clarity where Tommy Lee Jones is like, you're right, Bruce. He tries to appeal to Harvey. And for a second, Harvey's sane and talking to him. And it's like, oh, there's that relationship. But, that was like 20 seconds. And like I said, a missed opportunity. So.
And then the George Clooney one, the best part of the script, which I thought was at best mediocre, but it was a subplot which explains, it gives Bruce Wayne an out. He's been blaming himself for his parents' death, and he gets a piece of information, and he's not responsible for it. He thought that he made his parents go to the theater that night, and it turns out that they delayed their theater sojourn for 24 hours, so it wasn't his fault at all. I might quarrel with that as a Batman storyteller because I always thought that the symbolic avenging of the Wayne's death was part of the essence of the character. Nonetheless, that was a very well-written subplot that answered questions. And they just cut it.
Interesting.
They left a couple of lines in that don't make any sense without a context to put them in. But that is the movie biz.
I hear you, man. I wonder, I just, and not to name drop, but for context, a couple months ago, I had a dinner with Mark Miller, and we were talking about Superman, and the question of, is Superman Kal-El of Krypton, or is he Clark Kent that learns he's Kal-El of Krypton and grows up with the Earth values? And, Clark is the man, Superman is the guys. And Mark's disagreement was, no, he is, so smart being a Kryptonian that it's almost like being raised by a colony of ants in terms of the intellectual difference of a Kryptonian and an Earthman. And I wondered regarding, I'm sure you've been hit with this question before, is Batman the real man? Is Bruce Wayne a guise, or is this a traumatized Bruce Wayne that, is still, at the end of the day, a guy trying to do good? But, what is your thought on the Batman versus Bruce Wayne guys?
I think Bruce Wayne died with
His parents?
Mom and Dad.
Okay.
And from then on, Bruce allowed that tragedy to shape the life decisions he made. So in my mind, I never got from any writer except myself the kind of Bruce Wayne I wanted. There has been, particularly with the movies, a tendency to make Bruce Wayne, this very smart, ruthless tycoon guy. I think he should have been, I had a real-life person that owned a magazine I freelanced for.
Huh.
A guy who was really a nice man, inherited a vast fortune, and kind of blew it by never being able to get his act together. My Bruce Wayne would be driving a Ferrari, but he'd have a dent in the front fender because he backed it into he hit something the first time he took it out. And he was totally dependent on his assistants, as I occasionally was, to get things done. Love life, I didn't think there would have been any room for a relationship. So in my private version, Gotham City is full of debutantes who had one date with Bruce Wayne and said, he got a headache. He took me home at 10 o'clock. He just wasn't feeling well. I couldn't see him as a lover, and the information I just got that he's making it with Catwoman. Well, the dynamic with Ra's al Ghul was he could never get it on with Talia, though clearly they were the only two people on the planet who were ideal for each other. But she had a daddy hang-up, and he had a criminal hang-up, and she was a criminal, so he could never do that. I thought that added attention to the continuity that help the story along.
I understand. And what did you think when, there's a couple times when Steve Englehart created Silver St. Cloud and we had the Laughing Fish story? Were you editing then, or were you also...
No, I was a freelancer.
Okay, yeah, you guys were both writers of Batman. Okay. So...
And Steve convinced the powers that be that, he was a hot writer. I never paid attention to things like who's hot, or there was a kind of pecking order. If you were the guy who wrote Superman, you were higher on the pecking order than if you were the guy that wrote Power Man. But those things weren't part of some people's experience, and when I finally took over editing the franchise, I simply ignored Silver St. Cloud. I thought it was a bad idea. I didn't think that Batman would fall in love with a debutante. So we didn't have to write her out. We could just ignore her. It was the same way with Batman's child in that graphic novel that my bar did.
Son of the Demon.
I thought that was I thought that was a terrible idea in terms of Batman storytelling. But I didn't have to write it out. I explained to Mike, and we took a long walk around the lake in Hollywood, that I was not going to ever refer to that, and this is nothing against you, Mike. It's, in my editorial opinion, it's not a good storytelling trope. I don't think Mike has ever forgiven me for that, but they have brought those characters back, and that's now an official part of the continuity.
That's right. Yeah, Damian's part of the story now.
And you have to remember that there is no right or wrong in this.
Oh,
stuff.
Sure. Absolutely, man. Yeah.
That was my opinion of how the story and the mythos should play out. Doesn't mean I was right or wrong. It was my opinion, and it was working.
I understand. Absolutely, man. You're known for some of your guidelines, if not rules, for writing Batman. And I know one of them, and I imagine it might dovetail into what you were saying earlier about Superman. And I want to explore that for a second. But one thing I know that you said was you didn't like Batman in space, and that you would kind of, shy away from those stories and stuff as much as you could. Sometimes there was a big event, and I suppose, they expected the Batman comics to dovetail into an event. But it seemed, again, I only get my information from the fan magazines of the day, but it sounded like you weren't crazy about the idea of putting Batman in space.
I thought it was a terrible idea, in the same way it was a terrible idea for Eisner to put the Spirit in space. They're not that kind of character. The mythos, the mythic underpinnings. For Batman, it's more Dracula than Percival or any of the King Arthur's men.
Okay.
I don't think those guys were thinking about this stuff with the left side of their brains, but in a way, Batman is brilliant because we are fascinated by darkness and evil. Villains are almost always more interesting than heroes. Well, here you have that iconography of the dark, and in every culture that I know about, except Chinese, bats are symbols of evil or reincarnated souls or stuff like that. So you have that iconography, but he's on our side. He's a good guy. Mm-hmm. So you had your cake and eat it. Putting him in space makes it, what I think of as science fiction light, just not appropriate for the character as we were doing him then. It doesn't mean that somebody will come along and write a terrific Batman in space story.
Sure.
If it's happened, I haven't seen it.
Well, and how often, again, based on what you said about the Batman Superman ideas, that they were kind of conflicting universes in the same publishing house, how often did Superman show up in your Batman stories, if ever? Only when
there was a crossover. And I never resisted participating in the crossovers because that was going in. It's not your ball and it's not your bat, and your daddy doesn't own the park.
Sure.
Something that is like that, we had to participate in it. I was always able to contrive it so that Batman occupied a little distant corner of the story and could do Batman-like things and did not have to deal with ray guns and spaceships and aliens. The Batman as a storytelling tool was flexible enough that we could get away with cheating like that once in a while, as long as I didn't have to do it every month.
Understood. And again, what about the interpersonal relationship with Superman? How did you tackle it when it necessitated a conversation between Clark and Bruce?
I didn't ever write that scene. I don't remember. Well, Miller kind of answered that.
Sure.
If I'm remembering my continuity, Superman gives Batman a piece of kryptonite and says, if I ever go off the deep end, use this. I thought that was a good way to nod toward established continuity and still do it with a logical story point.
I think that was John.
So,
I think that was John Byrne in Man of Steel.
Was that Byrne?
Yeah, and I also wonder, as John Byrne came in, that period, because obviously you had Frank writing Batman Year One, and certainly before it, The Dark Knight Returns. That was such a great evolution of the character. And in the meantime, Byrne was doing his thing with Man of Steel, and obviously rebooting Superman and kind of changing things around, stripping away a lot of that Mort Weisinger era and even Julie Schwartz era, obviously. So how did when there was this newer Superman, did the character change at all for you from an editorial standpoint or a writing standpoint?
Yeah, excuse me. Water.
Oh yeah, by all means, yeah, Denny. And by the way, we've already gone an hour. Like, am I taxing you? I don't want to. No,
you're not. I have nothing to do until tomorrow at 2. So.
Well, I'm enjoying the conversation, so please continue.
But yeah, I resisted being involved with Superman when that first arose. And my problem was basically what we do is fantasy melodrama. The essence of melodrama is conflict. You have to have a worthy opponent for your hero. To have Superman go after pickpockets would be ludicrous. Well, how do you keep contriving a problem for Superman to solve? I mean, I did the Justice League for about a year and a half.
Absolutely.
And that's where that problem arose. When I did my 4th or 5th alien invasion, I realized my creative tank is empty as far as this character is concerned. Later writers did a much better job than I did of making it make sense and getting good stories out of it. But yeah, they to my mind, they did not belong in the same story. And if you have Superman, it depends on which era, but at his most powerful, he was God. He was juggling suns. He was able to search every room in Metropolis in a second or so. But how do you put that character in a believable conflict? He can do anything. So why doesn't he solve whatever problem it is in the second panel? You had to contrive answers to that if you were going to be consistent with the character. Back in the 40s when they were creating this stuff, they didn't worry about that. And they shouldn't have. I mean, it was not part of the problem they had to solve. A lot of them, well, Jerry, you mentioned Jerry before, who became a pretty close friend of mine toward the end of his life.
Jerry Siegel.
Great guy. And he did occasional script changes when he was, a very young guy doing comics. But that was okay because nobody knew how to write comic books back then. And the mistake I most often ran into when I was teaching was people ask things of the artist they can't deliver. So Jerry had a natural gift as a storyteller. He was a very good artist. And if some writer who had never written a comic book before asked for something that couldn't be accommodated in that very limited and artificial storytelling tool that was the comic book, Jerry could change it. I think that I've been rewritten a few times. I deeply, deeply resent it. It's one of the reasons I don't I don't read published work, and I made one horrible life mistake this within the past year. I watched myself on television. I watched the public. I don't normally do that because I don't like the way I look. But I watched the public television thing,
Yes.
and that was a terrible mistake on my part because it was apparently I didn't have much to do with Green Lantern and Green Arrow. Apparently the artist wanted to draw a Green Lantern, so he got Julie Schwartz to. And then Denny wrote a script.
Wow.
No, Denny wrote the script a long time before the artist was involved. Denny thought the script was going to be done by Gil Kane. But it's nothing to get lathery about, but it is annoying.
Well, let's set the record straight. Let's talk about that Green Lantern, Green Arrow run, because I was thinking about how Siegel and Schuster very early on in Superman really had Superman attacking social justice issues, and I know there was a very early issue where it cleaned out a slum and really kind of improved it. And,
went after an evil mine owner, a capitalist.
Yes, and of course, the famous radio story of him going after the Klan and things like that. So,
and also on the radio an anti-Semitic story.
Yes, very much so. Yes. So yeah, tell me, was the first Green Lantern, Green Arrow story about where that classic scene happens, where the elderly black gentleman says, "Hey, you saved the orange skins, you saved the purple skins. What are you doing for the black skins here on Earth?"
No, that was Neil did not only serve the script, but I thought that's among the three best panels ever in the history of comics. And one of the things that absolutely delights me is my favorite politician, who turns out to be a huge comics fan, and the only person I know who ever read all of Philip K. Dick. He used that as a campaign thing. He rewrote the dialogue.
Wow, cool.
That guy's name is Alan Grayson. He is a Democratic congressman currently up for re-election from Florida. And I got this. Mary took a phone call, and she said there's this congressman who wants to know if he can buy a coffee or a drink or something. And I thought, well, okay, he probably wants my help because he's going to do a campaign comic book. So I arranged to meet the guy, and no, we didn't talk about politics. We talked about comic books. I gave him a 5-minute crash course in visual narrative done in static images. And then he told me, we got on Philip K. Dick, and he told me that he had read all of Philip K. Dick's exegesis. I think that's something like 5,000 pages. I don't know anybody else who even tried to do that.
Very cool. I'm looking him up. I want to make sure. I think I know Alan Grayson. I think he's made himself known at times.
Well, he doesn't take corporate money. He's the real deal, as far as I can tell.
Yes, I'm looking.
I don't think it's possible to be a major politician and remain uncorrupted. But he's been on my radar for a few years now, and I get 2 or 3 emails from him in a week. He looks like the real deal. As I said, he grew up in the Bronx. He was a street kid.
Well, he seems to have been a strong, as I remember seeing video clips of him, I know he was a strong proponent for, better health care, and certainly was complaining about the Republicans' answer. And I remember a famous quote of his of, the Republican solution is you get sick, you don't get health care, and you die. And that's how they solve the health care issue. So, no, I know exactly what you're talking about. And isn't it always great when you learn various people who are comic book people? And I certainly get a kick out of it when I hear not only celebrities, but also, again, Brad Meltzer, I forget which specific politician had Green Arrow in his office, and as he was getting started with his Green Arrow run, referred to, I believe he was a governor, and and it certainly wasn't Jeb Bush. That's his local governor down in Florida. But no, that's great. And I wanted to know. So when you suggested these stories to Julie Schwartz, I'm assuming, and you guys were kind of putting more social justice in these stories, was there a concern? Was there like, hey, we don't want to, we're telling stories for 12-year-olds. Why, what are you doing putting these kinds of issues in stories?
I wondered the same thing. So I talked to Julie a lot for the last year of his life. I talked to him every Thursday morning. I was going in to teach a class, and he was coming in and would walk up and down the halls and stick his head in open doors and say, "What are you doing?" to editors. So I don't think Julie bothered to ask permission. I once asked him, well, the conventional wisdom in the 40s and 50s was you can't have continued stories because the newsstand distribution was so erratic that because I got Detective Party 5, that doesn't mean I will be able to get Detective Party 6.
Yes.
And yet he did a continued story once a year. And I said, how did you get away with that? And he said, I didn't ask, but nobody ever said anything. I think with Green Lantern and Green Arrow, he didn't see any need to share what we were doing with anyone. And so, yeah, I mean, the genesis of that was paying my weekly visit to D.C., and I do a terrible Julie Schwartz little, well, my boy, what have you got? And it was a very avuncular editor. And I had done a couple of things, one of them for him with social concerns near the center of the story. And I wanted to do more. I was genuinely concerned with what was going on in the world. So he said that he personally, I think, wanted to continue publishing Green Lantern. The science fiction elements of it must have appealed to him.
Sure.
But the sales did not justify continued publication. So he pretty much gave me a blank slate. I told him an idea or two I had, and then I went home and wrote the story. And then I wrote another one and another one. And at that point, the first one was on the newsstand, and we got noticed by reporters. The first story that appeared was in the Village Voice, a counterculture newspaper from Greenwich Village that was on my must-reading list.
I hear you. Me too.
Yeah, it was founded by Norman Mailer in a bar I used to frequent. Anyway, I think that somebody at The Voice saw this and thought there might be a story there and called the number that was in the telephone book for DC Comics. Maybe got a receptionist or an assistant editor, somebody who didn't know what we were doing, because Julie wasn't mentioned in the Village Voice piece, nor was I, nor was Neil. And I think they didn't know what they were doing. That changed rapidly and drastically, and I found myself being interviewed by Parisian television. That was an experience not many people have had.
Wow.
And we got invited to universities, and we were suddenly respectable. But I think that came as a surprise to the people in the big office, because comic books, we don't have. I doubt that they read it. One of the real pluses in the Paul Levitt column is he did read this stuff, and he had opinions about it. But I don't think any of the executives bothered. And so this came as a surprise to them, but it came as a surprise that came with an endorsement from the mayor of New York City, among other people. So they saw a bandwagon they could hop on, and that mayor eventually wrote a text piece for us. He was the last liberal Republican mayor in the United States.
Was that John Lindsay?
Lindsay, yeah.
John Lindsay, yeah. No, I remember.
Yeah.
And I've certainly seen my share of video of Mayor Lindsay and everything. And of course, kind of Batman television fans might know that there was a parody of him in the television show as well. Mayor Linseed, I believe, was how he was called. But you kind of, if you knew your history of politics, you knew who they were talking about back then. That's cool. And also, I remember your amazing issue of Green Lantern, Green Arrow, where clearly, as at least from an artist standpoint, it was Spiro Agnew in the story, and there was a little girl that had a face very much like Richard Nixon's face.
Yeah, and therein though lies another sore point, because I didn't know that cover was going to be done. The problem with it was that had nothing to do with the story. It had nothing to do with the continuity. You could certainly attack Agnew and Nixon, though at least one of my freelancers who's a conservative said he found it offensive.
Interesting.
But at the time, I thought it was so obvious that these guys are crooks and corrupt, there won't be any problem with this. Well, there are people who think that Nixon was a great president.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
I resented that because what did it have to do with anything? It didn't make any political comment of its own, and it had nothing to do with the story.
Interesting.
Occasionally, Julie would let things get by that I couldn't understand why he did. That was an example. I don't know that I would have okayed that cover had I been editing the thing at the time.
Understood. No, I understand. Okay, we're going to stop there. I promise more great stuff in part 2. You don't want to miss it. And thanks, as always, for supporting Word Balloon. Until next time, this is John saying, take it easy. Word Balloon is a copyright feature of Shaky Productions. Copyright 2024.